Michael Turner had built his life on the illusion of control. From the polished windows of his office tower in Atlanta's financial district to the shimmering marble floors of his Buckhead mansion, every detail reflected his relentless pursuit of perfection. At 52, his reputation as a sharp-minded executive was unquestioned, and his name carried weight in boardrooms across the country. Yet beneath the tailored suits and measured smiles, he carried something invisible, a silence that pressed against his chest, waiting for the moment it would finally break him. That moment arrived on a warm spring evening. The ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton glowed with golden chandeliers as employees and investors gathered for the annual celebration of Turner Capital's record-breaking year. Glasses clinked, conversations buzzed, and Michael stood at the center, shaking hands with politicians and CEOs, his presence commanding the room. His speech had been polished, precise, a promise of more victories to come. Applause thundered, champagne poured, and laughter rose like smoke into the high ceilings. But just as the music swelled, Michael's hand trembled around the glass he held. His vision blurred. For a second he dismissed it as exhaustion, another late night written into the cost of success. He tried to straighten his tie, to force himself into composure, but the room spun, the chandelier above fragmenting into 1,000 shards of light. His legs buckled, the champagne flute slipped from his hand, and he collapsed to the polished floor. Gasps sliced through the air, followed by silence so heavy it swallowed the music whole. "Call 911," a voice shouted from the crowd. The mighty executive, who once silenced boardrooms with a glance, now lay helpless, his breath ragged, his face pale. Guests pressed forward, uncertain, their power useless in the face of his sudden fragility. A circle formed, but no one dared touch him, as if his collapse had revealed a truth no one wished to claim. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Stories like this one hold more than suspense. They carry lessons about resilience, humility, and the unexpected turns that shape a life. The paramedics arrived swiftly, moving with precision as they lifted him onto a stretcher. Michael's eyes fluttered, catching fragments of faces. Investors who once admired him, employees who feared him, friends who had long since drifted away. Their voices blurred into meaningless noise as the sirens pierced the night. Inside the ambulance, the city lights streaked by, but Michael's thoughts scattered like broken glass. He tried to summon strength, the same force that had carried him through countless negotiations, but his body betrayed him. A cold sweat clung to his skin, and his heart pounded like a drum losing rhythm. At Emory University Hospital, doctors rushed him through gleaming corridors, their words clipped and urgent. "Male, 52, sudden collapse, possible cardiac event," one voice said. Another countered, "Could be neurological, get scans ready." Michael could hear them speaking as though he were already gone, his identity reduced to symptoms and probabilities. Back in Buckhead, news spread quickly. His daughter, Rachel, received the call with a numbness that surprised her. Their relationship had been fractured for years, her father's devotion to his empire leaving little room for family. Still, hearing the words "critical condition" shook her in a way she could not disguise. She pressed her palm against the kitchen counter, steadying herself as memories of neglected birthdays and broken promises surfaced like wounds refusing to heal. In Michael's mansion, another person listened with quiet concern. Angela Brown, the maid who had worked in the Turner household for nearly a decade, heard the news while cleaning the study. She lowered the feather duster slowly, her heart tightening. Though she was invisible to him most days, she knew his routines, his silences, and the weight he carried. Unlike the crowd that had cheered his victories, Angela had seen the late nights when he returned home drained, silent, and too proud to admit weakness. As Michael lay unconscious in a sterile hospital room, the battle for his survival had only begun. Surgeons prepared, family members gathered, and whispers of uncertainty filled the halls. Yet far beyond the doctor's hands and medical charts, another story was beginning, one that would challenge everything he believed about control, dignity, and the people he had overlooked his entire life. The fall of Michael Turner was not the end. It was the beginning of something none of them could have foreseen. The air inside Emory University Hospital carried the faint metallic scent of disinfectant. Fluorescent lights cast a pale glow across the hallways, their hum mingling with the steady rhythm of machines and hurried footsteps. Nurses pushed carts, doctors exchanged clipped words, and behind the closed doors of the intensive care unit, Michael Turner lay at the mercy of science. His condition had rattled the hospital staff. Here was a man whose name appeared in newspapers, whose financial empire reached into every corner of the city. Yet stripped of his tailored suit and power, he looked like any other patient, vulnerable, exposed, dependent. Electrodes clung to his chest, monitors traced the jagged path of his heartbeat, and an oxygen mask pressed against his face. "Pressure's unstable," a nurse reported, her voice sharp with urgency. "Prep him for an angiogram," the lead physician ordered. "We need to rule out a coronary blockage before we lose any more time." They moved swiftly, their professionalism precise, but their eyes betrayed unease. Every test returned results that deepened the mystery. His arteries were clear, his heart showed strain but no fatal damage, and neurological scans revealed nothing decisive. It was as though his body had collapsed under an invisible weight no instrument could measure. Meanwhile, the waiting room swelled with restless energy. Business partners in tailored suits whispered among themselves, checking phones, calculating the future of Turner Capital if its founder did not survive. Their concern carried a sheen of self-interest, their voices more anxious about stock prices than the man fighting for breath. Rachel Turner sat apart, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. She tried to steady her breathing, but memories flickered unbidden. Her father's sharp words during her teenage years, the endless meetings he prioritized over family dinners, the unreachable figure who stood like a fortress between himself and everyone else. Still, watching him suffer was something she had never imagined. A doctor finally approached her, his expression caught between professionalism and frustration. "Ms. Turner," he said softly, "we've ruled out major cardiac blockage. We're still running tests, but we don't have an answer yet." Rachel blinked, her voice thin but sharp. "What do you mean you don't have an answer?" He collapsed in front of hundreds of people. "Something caused it." "We're doing everything we can," the doctor replied. "Sometimes medicine takes time. We'll keep him under observation and continue searching for the cause." Rachel looked away, her jaw tightening. For the first time in years, she wished she could hear her father's commanding voice telling her what to do. Instead, silence pressed against her chest. Inside his room, Michael drifted between fragments of consciousness. He caught pieces of conversation, the clipped urgency of surgeons, the muttered doubts of nurses, but they blurred like voices underwater. He tried to form words, to assert the authority that had guided him all his life, but his lips barely moved. His body, once disciplined by routine and control, refused to obey. In one fleeting moment of clarity, he opened his eyes. The sterile white ceiling above offered no comfort, only a reflection of his helplessness. He thought of boardrooms, where he had dictated terms, of contracts signed under his unyielding gaze, of victories that once defined him. Yet here none of it mattered. Not one of those triumphs could command his failing body to rise. Time passed in sterile monotony. Beeping machines marked each second, their sounds a reminder that his life balanced on fragile rhythms. Doctors cycled in and out, each bringing new theories, none bringing solutions. Outside his door, Rachel stood again, watching through the glass panel. Her reflection merged with his still form inside, two Turners separated by years of distance and an unspoken chasm of regret. She whispered under her breath, almost ashamed of the words, "Don't leave yet. Please." But inside, Michael's thoughts wavered between shadows and silence. He realized with a sting of irony that for the first time in his life, his wealth, his influence, and the sterile hands of medicine could not guarantee control. And in that helpless stillness, the story of his survival began to shift toward unexpected hands, waiting in the shadows. While Michael Turner lay suspended between life and uncertainty, his mansion in Buckhead stood silent, its vast rooms echoing with absence. From the outside, The white-pillared estate projected power and wealth, but inside, the atmosphere was heavy, as though the collapse of its master had cracked the illusion of permanence. Angela Brown moved quietly through the halls, her footsteps softened by the polished hardwood floors she had cleaned for nearly a decade. At 38, she carried herself with the kind of composure earned from years of labor unnoticed, a calm presence woven into the fabric of the house itself. She had watched children grow, a wife fade, and a man bury himself in work so deeply he forgot the meaning of presence. As she dusted the heavy oak shelves of the study, she paused. The silence was unnatural. Usually Michael's return was predictable, doors opening with controlled precision. His jacket hung on the same chair, his voice low and clipped as he made a late call to some associate. Now, without him, the house seemed to sag under the weight of its emptiness. Angela placed the cloth aside and sat for a moment on the edge of the leather chair he favored. Her thoughts drifted to the call she'd overheard from Rachel earlier. The daughter's voice strained with equal parts frustration and grief. Though Angela kept her place in the household, she couldn't help but care. She had always noticed what others ignored. Michael's skipping meals, the tightness in his jaw during long phone calls, the way he sometimes rubbed his chest absent-mindedly late at night. Her memories wandered back to his late wife, Caroline. Unlike Michael, Caroline had spoken freely with Angela, treating her not as invisible labor, but as a confidant in quiet moments. Caroline had once said, half in jest and half in resignation, "You probably know him better than anyone, Angela. He won't admit it, but he listens more than he lets on." Angela had never forgotten those words, though Michael himself had rarely acknowledged her presence. That afternoon, Rachel arrived at the mansion. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, but her expression betrayed exhaustion. She moved briskly, as though each step were an effort to outrun her emotions. Angela watched her from a respectful distance before approaching with quiet care. "Miss Turner," Angela said softly. Rachel turned, her eyes sharp but tired. "Angela, I didn't expect to see you here. I thought it best to keep the house in order. With everything going on—" Angela hesitated, reading the grief written across Rachel's face. "How is he?" Rachel exhaled, her shoulders sagging. "The doctors don't know. Can you believe that? With all the money, all the specialists, and they still can't explain why he's like this." Angela nodded slowly. "Sometimes what a person carries doesn't show up on a chart." Rachel's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Angela chose her words carefully. "Your father, he's a strong man, but strength can hide burdens. I've seen him come home late, pushing himself harder than anyone should. He never let anyone in, not even when he needed rest." Rachel looked away, her throat tightening. "That sounds like him." He always thought slowing down was weakness. For a moment, silence hung between them, the kind that carried truth too heavy to speak outright. Angela respected boundaries, but she also knew what her eyes had witnessed over the years. While others saw only Michael's authority, she had seen the cracks, the exhaustion, the subtle decline masked by pride. Rachel broke the silence first. "You've been here longer than most people. You've probably seen more than I have. I didn't even realize how bad things had gotten." Angela's voice softened. "Sometimes it takes distance to see what's right in front of us." The house remained still, as though listening. Angela knew her role, yet something inside her stirred, a sense that her place in this unfolding storm might demand more than quiet service. And as night settled over the mansion, the weight of unspoken truths pressed deeper, hinting that the fragile household would not remain untouched by the battles ahead. The Turner mansion gleamed with the kind of opulence that demanded admiration from strangers, but offered little comfort to those who lived inside. Marble floors stretched endlessly, polished until they reflected the light of crystal chandeliers. Expensive art adorned the walls, abstracts Michael had purchased more for their price tags than for meaning. Each room whispered wealth, yet carried a coldness that no amount of decoration could soften. Rachel wandered through those rooms late that evening, her heels echoing in the emptiness. She paused at the dining hall, where a long mahogany table stretched like a barrier rather than a gathering place. As a child, she remembered sitting there across from her father. the silence between them filled only by the sound of cutlery. Even family meals had felt like negotiations, her father's attention divided between reports and phone calls. Now, standing in that cavernous space, Rachel realized how little warmth had ever lived there. Angela followed discreetly, carrying a folded cloth in her hands, not out of necessity but habit. Her eyes scanned the mansion with a different perspective. She had polished every surface, tended to every corner, and yet she understood better than anyone that the place was hollow. She remembered Caroline's laughter once filling the kitchen, softening the hard edges of Michael's ambition. After Caroline's passing, the laughter died and the house hardened into what it was now, luxury without life. Rachel stopped by the grand piano in the living room, its black surface gleaming under the muted lights. "He bought this for me when I was 12, she said quietly, her voice laced with bitterness. "Told me it would build discipline. But he never once listened to me play." Angela set the cloth aside, speaking gently. "Sometimes gifts are easier than presents." Rachel looked at her, eyes narrowing. "You sound like you know him better than I do." Angela hesitated, her tone respectful. "I've seen the way he lived here, the schedules, the long nights, the way he buried himself in work. He thought that by keeping everything perfect, nothing could fall apart." Rachel's lips curved into a bitter smile. "And yet here we are." Angela didn't respond immediately. She glanced at the staircase, remembering countless evenings when Michael returned home long after midnight, his tie loosened, his eyes distant, his steps heavy. He never complained, never spoke of weakness, but the toll had been visible to anyone willing to notice. Angela had noticed, always in silence. Rachel sighed, sinking onto the velvet sofa. "You know what's strange? I don't even know how to feel. I'm angry, I'm scared, and part of me still wants to scream at him for everything he missed. Birthdays, graduations, even when Mom got sick. He was always at work, always chasing something bigger." Angela sat carefully at the edge of another chair, folding her hands in her lap. "Grief and anger often walk together. It doesn't mean one cancels the other." Rachel studied her, her expression softening. "You talk like you've carried this before." Angela's eyes lowered for a moment. "I've carried what life handed me. And I've learned that strength doesn't always look like what we expect." Silence lingered, heavier now as the ticking of a distant clock echoed through the hall. Rachel leaned back, staring at the ceiling, her voice barely above a whisper. "This house feels like a museum of everything he cared about, but none of it feels alive. None of it feels like him." Angela let the words settle, then spoke with quiet certainty. "Sometimes the things we surround ourselves with show not who we are, but what we're afraid of losing." Rachel looked at her, startled by the depth of the remark, and for the first time that evening, she felt less alone in the vast emptiness of her father's empire. As the night deepened, the mansion remained grand, but its hollowness became undeniable. And in that void, both women sensed that the story unfolding was no longer about possessions, but about the fragile ties that wealth had never been able to mend. Days blurred together in the sterile corridors of Emory University Hospital. Each morning brought a new team of doctors, their voices brisk, their clipboards filled with theories. They tested Michael Turner for everything they could imagine: blood clots, infections, rare cardiac conditions, but every result returned with frustrating ambiguity. He was sick, yes, gravely so, but the exact cause remained elusive. The precision of medicine collided with mystery, leaving him trapped between diagnosis and decline. One physician suggested an aggressive course of anticoagulants, another pressed for neurological exploration, while a third proposed experimental treatments not yet fully approved. Michael's body became a battlefield of hypotheses, every remedy offered with confidence, yet none delivering recovery. Rachel spent long hours by his bedside, her frustration mounting with each failed attempt. "You're telling me you don't know?" she demanded one evening, when the cardiologist explained that Michael's condition hadn't improved. "We've stabilized him as best we can," the doctor replied, his tone clipped but weary. "There are limits to what science can predict." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Limits? He built an empire from nothing, and you're telling me you can't figure out what's killing him?" The doctor shifted uncomfortably. "We're not giving up. But sometimes medicine is more art than certainty." Her voice cracked with anger and despair. "That's not good enough." Inside the hospital room, Michael drifted in and out of awareness. His once sharp mind now floated in fog, catching fragments of sound. The steady beep of monitors, the rustle of gowns, the muffled arguments between his daughter and the doctors. He wanted to rise, to speak with the authority that had once silenced entire rooms, but his body betrayed him. Even lifting a hand required monumental effort. At night, when the hospital quieted, the weight of failure pressed hardest. Nurses adjusted his IV lines, whispered updates into charts, but none of it changed the truth. Every procedure had left him weaker. His skin grew pale, his frame thinner, his spirit dimmer. Rachel, exhausted, often left the hospital after midnight, returning to the empty mansion that mocked her with its luxury. She would sit at the kitchen counter, staring at the polished granite, remembering how her mother used to fill that space with warmth and food, while her father remained absent in meetings or distant behind closed doors. Now the emptiness felt unbearable, a mirror of his condition. Angela, meanwhile, continued her quiet watch from a distance. Though she was not family, she called the hospital daily, asking in her steady voice, "How is Mr. Turner today?" The staff rarely gave her details, but she pieced together the truth from Rachel's weary answers. Each report confirmed what Angela already sensed. The surgeon's remedies, for all their cost and brilliance, were failing. One evening, Rachel returned home and found Angela in the study, straightening the rows of books Michael rarely touched. For a moment, Rachel simply stood in the doorway, her shoulders heavy with defeat. Angela looked up, reading her expression immediately. "It hasn't improved, has it?" Rachel shook her head. "Every day it's the same. More tests, more guesses. They act like they're in control, but he just keeps slipping further away." Angela's eyes softened. "Sometimes knowledge doesn't hold all the answers." Rachel's voice broke. "Then what does? Because I'm watching him disappear, and I can't stop it." Angela didn't offer false comfort. Instead, she placed the book back in its place and replied quietly, "Maybe the question isn't only what's wrong with him, but what's been left unseen." Rachel frowned at the cryptic words, too tired to press further. She left Angela in the study, the weight of helplessness pressing harder than ever. At the hospital, Michael's heart monitor flickered irregularly for a moment before steadying again. The doctors called it a normal complication, but to those who watched him closely, it felt like another reminder. The remedies were failing, and time was slipping away. The silence that followed was heavier than any diagnosis. Angela Brown had always known her place. In the Turner household, she moved like the air, present, essential, yet unnoticed. She respected boundaries, worked with diligence, and rarely allowed herself to think she mattered beyond the chores she performed. Yet as Michael's collapse deepened into mystery, memories began to stir within her, fragments of conversations and small observations that refused to be silenced. She remembered Caroline Turner, frail but graceful, sitting at the kitchen table during those final months of illness. Angela would bring her tea, and Caroline, in her gentle way, would insist she stay a moment. Those moments often stretched into long talks, confessions whispered in the quiet hours, when the mansion seemed too heavy for one woman to bear. Caroline spoke of her worries for Rachel, of her loneliness in Michael's shadow, and, most strikingly, of Michael himself. "He'll drive himself into the ground one day," Caroline had said once, her voice soft but certain. "He believes strength is never stopping. But one day, Angela, his body will betray him. And when that day comes, he won't know how to ask for help." Angela had listened, the words carving themselves into her memory. Now, years later, as Michael lay trapped between life and death, Caroline's warning echoed louder than ever. In the mansion's quiet study, Angela ran her fingers along the spines of books lined in perfect rows. She remembered how Michael would return late at night, pouring himself a drink he rarely finished, staring out the window as though searching for answers in the city lights. He never confided in her, but his silence spoke volumes. His body had carried a weight that medicine might never fully measure: stress, regret, isolation. She thought of the nights when she found untouched dinners left in the kitchen, the mornings when his coffee cup was abandoned half full, his phone buzzing endlessly, the way his hand sometimes pressed against his chest absent-mindedly, as though reminding himself he was still alive. Doctors looked for diseases, but Angela wondered if they had ever asked about his life. Her sense of duty wavered between silence and action. She was the maid, not a doctor, not family. Who would take her seriously? Who would listen to her voice, tucked away in the shadows of this household? And yet, what if what she had seen, the small patterns invisible to those who only knew him through charts, mattered more than anyone realized? Late that night, she sat at the edge of her bed in the small room tucked away near the back of the mansion. The house was still, but her mind raced. She could almost hear Caroline's voice urging her not to remain silent. She clasped her hands, whispering into the quiet. What if I'm the only one who sees it? What if they need me, even if they don't know it yet? Her chest tightened at the thought. She knew the risks of stepping forward, dismissal, ridicule, perhaps even being cast out of the only livelihood she had. Michael had never valued her presence beyond the tasks she performed. Would Rachel? Would the doctors? And yet, deep within, something stronger than fear began to rise. Angela had lived long enough to know that dignity was not given. It was claimed in moments when silence cost too much. She could not shake the feeling that her knowledge, her quiet observations, her years of unseen service held pieces of the puzzle that no machine could provide. As the night stretched on, Angela felt the weight of choice pressing heavily against her heart. She was just the maid. But perhaps just this once, being just the maid meant being the only one who could see what others refused to notice. The mansion around her remained silent, but in Angela's chest, a voice long suppressed whispered louder. It was time to decide whether to stay in the shadows or step into the storm. Angela Brown had never been one to seek confrontation, but the weight in her chest had grown impossible to ignore. The doctors continued circling Michael's case with their polished language and inconclusive results, while Rachel sank deeper into despair. Angela knew what she had seen over the years: the skipped meals, the relentless nights, the quiet signals of a man stretched too far. And she knew those details mattered, even if the specialists dismissed them as irrelevant. On a grey afternoon, Rachel returned from the hospital, shoulders slumped, her eyes rimmed with fatigue. She found Angela in the kitchen, carefully arranging the silverware that hadn't been touched in days. "You look exhausted," Angela said gently. Rachel dropped her bag onto the counter, her frustration spilling out. "Because I am. Every doctor gives me a different theory. They poke, they scan, they medicate, and still, nothing changes. It's like they're guessing." Angela hesitated, her hands tightening around the cloth she held. Then she spoke, her voice low but steady. "Miss Turner, may I say something?" Rachel exhaled, half distracted. "Go ahead." "I've watched your father for years," Angela began, choosing her words with care. "The late nights, the way he skipped meals, how he held his chest sometimes without realizing it. He pushed himself harder than most men I've ever seen. The doctors see charts, but I saw him, I saw the way he lived." Rachel looked at her skeptical. "You think you know more than the surgeons?" Angela shook her head. "Not more, different. They're searching for what's wrong inside him. But maybe it's not only inside, it's everything he carried on his shoulders, every choice he made without rest. His body's been breaking down for years." For a moment, Rachel said nothing. She stared at Angela, torn between disbelief and the faint pull of truth in her words. Finally, she muttered, "Even if you're right, what am I supposed to do? They won't listen to me, let alone you." Angela's voice grew firmer, the doubt in her own chest giving way to conviction. "Then make them listen. Remind them he's more than numbers on a screen. If they don't understand his life, they'll never understand his illness." Rachel rubbed her temples, her resistance softening under Angela's quiet certainty. "You really believe this matters?" "I do," Angela said, her tone unwavering. "Sometimes the smallest details save a life. I can't stand back anymore, not when I've seen what they overlook. The words hung in the air, charged with more power than either woman expected. Rachel's breath caught, her anger shifting into something else, reluctant hope mixed with fear of disappointment. Later that evening at the hospital, Rachel found herself pacing outside Michael's room as another round of doctors debated his condition. Their jargon filled the hallway, each theory colliding with the next. Rachel clenched her fists, Angela's words echoing in her mind. Finally, she interrupted. "You keep talking like he's a puzzle," she snapped, her voice trembling. "But none of you know him. You don't know how he lived, what he put himself through. You treat him like a case file, but he's a man. And maybe the way he lived is killing him more than anything you've found." The doctors exchanged skeptical glances. One adjusted his glasses, his voice clipped. "We appreciate your concern, Ms. Turner, but medical conditions aren't explained by stress alone. We need evidence." Rachel's frustration flared. "Then listen to the people who actually saw him. Listen to Angela. She worked in his house for years. She knows what his days were like." The dismissive look that crossed the physician's face stung, but Rachel stood firm. Her father's life was slipping away, and if it meant breaking the invisible walls that kept Angela's voice unheard, she was willing to fight. Angela, waiting quietly nearby, felt the moment shift. For the first time, her silence had broken into action. Her place in the shadows no longer enough. What remained uncertain was whether the world around her would allow her voice to be heard. The conference room adjacent to Michael Turner's ICU was filled with tension sharp enough to cut the air. Around the polished table sat his business partners, men in tailored suits, whose eyes darted between their phones and each other. To them, Michael's illness wasn't just a tragedy, it was a looming financial disaster. "If this drags on much longer, shareholders will panic," one of them muttered. Another leaned forward, his voice cold. "We need contingency plans." Turner Capital cannot afford to appear leaderless. Rachel, seated across from them, slammed her hand on the table. "My father is fighting for his life, and all you care about is profit margins." The men exchanged uneasy glances. One of them sighed, attempting a gentler tone. "Rachel, we understand your emotions, but the company is a living organism. If we don't act now, everything your father built could collapse." Her voice trembled with fury. "Everything he built? You mean everything he bled for, everything that kept him from his family, everything that's killing him now? Don't talk to me about what he built. You never cared about the cost." Silence followed, heavy and unyielding. For the first time, Rachel felt the walls closing in, not just from the hospital corridors, but from the empire itself. Her father's legacy was both crown and chain, and she stood in the middle, powerless. When the meeting adjourned, she stepped into the hallway where Angela was waiting quietly. The maid's presence was like a steady anchor amid the storm. "They don't care about him," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking. "To them, he's just a machine that stopped working." Angela's gaze was calm but firm. "Machines don't break without reason, and men aren't machines, no matter how much they try to be." Rachel rubbed her temples, exhaustion clouding her expression. "You really believe the way he lived is the key, don't you?" Angela nodded. "I've watched him long enough to know it. He lived on stress, skipped food, ignored sleep. He carried the weight of that company like it was carved into his skin. You can't measure that with a scan. But it leaves scars all the same." Rachel's chest tightened, torn between skepticism and the undeniable truth in Angela's voice. "If you're right, how do I convince them?" "The doctors, the partners, they don't want to hear it." Angela hesitated, then said softly, "Sometimes the truth isn't spoken to convince. Sometimes it's spoken so it can no longer be ignored." Her words lingered as Rachel stared through the glass window into her father's room. Michael lay motionless, wires and tubes tethering him to machines that hummed with artificial rhythm. For all the science surrounding him, he looked like a man weighed down by years of silent burdens. Later that night, Rachel returned to his bedside. She sat close, watching the faint rise and fall of his chest. For the first time in years, she spoke to him without anger. "I don't know if you can hear me," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "But if you can, you have to fight differently this time. You can't push through like a deal you're trying to win. You have to let someone else in. Because all your strength, it's killing you, Dad." Her words, though met with no response, seemed to echo in the room. Angela stood just outside the door, her hand pressed lightly against the glass. She didn't enter, but her steady presence was felt all the same. In that fragile moment, both women carried the same realization. Truth was heavy, but silence was heavier. Whether the doctors listened or not, whether the businessmen cared or not, the path forward would depend on whether they dared to speak what had long remained unspoken. And as the monitors beeped in steady defiance, Rachel sensed that the next step would demand more courage than either of them had yet shown. The night pressed heavily against the hospital windows, the city beyond glowing in scattered lights, while inside Michael Turner's room the atmosphere was hushed, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of machines. Rachel sat slumped in a chair beside his bed, exhaustion carving lines into her young face. She had been speaking to him for hours, fragmented confessions, apologies, memories, yet no flicker of response had come. She brushed her hand across her cheeks, weary from tears, when she noticed a shift. Michael's eyelids fluttered. His lips moved dry and uncertain, as if dredging words from a place buried deep. "Rachel." His voice was barely a breath. She jerked upright, gripping his hand. "Dad? Can you hear me?" "It's me. I'm here." His eyes opened slightly, clouded yet aware enough to recognize her. The sight pulled a sob from her chest. She squeezed his fingers, desperate to anchor him. "Don't try to talk. Just stay with me." But Michael, even in weakness, sought control. "Sorry," he whispered, each syllable heavy with effort. "For not being there." Rachel's breath caught, tears spilling freely. "Don't say that now. Please. Just focus on fighting." The door creaked softly, and Angela stepped inside, hesitant yet unable to remain outside any longer. Her presence filled the room with quiet steadiness. She moved closer, standing at the far side of the bed, her gaze fixed gently on Michael. His eyes, though dim, shifted toward her. Recognition sparked, faint but real. For the first time in years, he saw Angela not as background, not as silent labor, but as someone who had always been there. His lips trembled and a fragile word escaped. "Angela." Rachel turned, startled. "You know her name?" Michael's breath rattled as he spoke again, each word fractured but unmistakable. "Always there, quiet, strong." Angela's throat tightened. She had prepared herself for dismissal, for invisibility, but not for this fragile gratitude. She stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on the bed frame. "I've only done what I could, Mr. Turner." His eyes locked on hers with surprising intensity, even in weakness. "Don't leave." Angela swallowed hard, her composure wavering. "I won't." Rachel looked between them, a mixture of confusion and dawning realization flooding her. She had never imagined her father even noticed Angela's presence, let alone valued it. Yet here he was, clinging not only to his daughter but also to the maid who had served in silence for years. The machines continued their mechanical rhythm, but in that room, a different rhythm began to take shape. One of vulnerability, truth, and fragile connection. Rachel leaned closer, brushing her father's hand with both of hers. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," she whispered. Michael's eyelids fluttered, his strength already waning, but his faint nod was enough. It was the first admission of dependence he had ever allowed. Angela stood steady, her presence a quiet pillar. Inside, her heart ached. She had wanted to remain in the shadows, but now the shadows no longer held her. She understood with painful clarity that she could not step back again. His plea was not just a moment of weakness, it was an opening, a demand for her courage to meet his vulnerability. The silence that followed was heavy, yet alive, carrying the unspoken truth that the walls between them had finally cracked. Rachel's hand trembled as she held onto her father, while Angela stood anchored, her resolve deepening with every passing second. For years, Michael Turner had spoken with authority that commanded rooms. Tonight, with only whispers and weakness, he had spoken more truth than ever before. And in that truth, Angela knew. The silence was broken, and her role in his survival had only just begun. The following morning, the hospital corridors buzzed with renewed urgency. Doctors gathered outside Michael Turner's room, exchanging clipped remarks as though preparing for battle. Inside, Rachel sat beside her father, still processing the fragile words he had spoken the night before. Across from her stood Angela, steady and quiet, her presence no longer hidden in the background. The lead physician entered, a tall man with silver hair and an air of authority that filled the room before he spoke. "Ms. Turner, we've reviewed your father's case again. His condition hasn't stabilized as we hoped. We need to make decisions, immediate ones." Rachel straightened, her voice cautious. "What decisions?" "Another invasive procedure," the doctor replied firmly. "It's risky, but without intervention, his chances of recovery diminish every hour." Angela shifted slightly, her hands clasped in front of her. She had heard enough of their confident guesses. "Excuse me, doctor," she said, her voice respectful but clear. "With all due respect, you've tried procedures already and none have worked. Has anyone considered that his life outside these walls is the reason his body collapsed?" The physician's eyes flicked toward her, dismissive. "And you are," Rachel interjected, before Angela could answer. "This is Angela Brown. She worked in our home for years. She knows my father's habits better than anyone." The doctor's brow arched, his tone turning sharper. "With all respect, Ms. Turner, medical care is not determined by domestic staff. We're dealing with science, not speculation." Rachel's frustration flared. "Speculation? That's all you've done since this started. Test after test, and you still don't know why he collapsed. Angela has seen him day after day. She knows the patterns you don't." Angela held her ground, her voice steady though her heart raced. "He lived under constant strain. He skipped meals, ignored rest, pushed himself beyond reason. His body wasn't broken by one event. It's years of pressure catching up. If you don't address that, no procedure will save him." The room thickened with tension. The doctor's jaw tightened, his authority challenged. "Ms. Turner, if you let unqualified voices dictate treatment, you put your father at risk." Rachel stood, her voice trembling but resolute. "And if I let arrogance dictate treatment, I might lose him altogether. I'm not dismissing your expertise, but don't dismiss what she knows. She may not be a doctor, but she knows my father's life better than you ever will." Michael stirred faintly on the bed, his breathing shallow, his eyes flickering open just long enough to glance between them. He couldn't speak, but the faint squeeze of Rachel's hand seemed to echo her words. Angela looked at him, then back at the doctors. "I'm not asking you to ignore medicine. I'm asking you to listen, to see him as a man, not just a chart. Sometimes healing needs more than sterile hands." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with conflicting wills. Nurses shifted uneasily, caught between hierarchy and humanity. The doctor finally exhaled, his tone clipped but less sharp. "We'll note your perspective, but the responsibility for his life rests with us." Rachel sat again, holding her father's hand tightly. She whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "Responsibility doesn't mean control. Not anymore." Angela remained standing, her presence a quiet defiance against dismissal. For years she had been unseen. Now she refused to step back. The clash had begun, not only between doctors and family, but between two visions of care, one built on sterile expertise, the other on lived truth. And as the machines continued their steady rhythm, it was clear that Michael's survival would depend on more than medical decisions. It would depend on whose voice was finally allowed to matter. The hospital room was still, the only sounds the steady hum of machines and the faint rhythm of Michael Turner's labored breaths. Rachel sat close to his bed, clutching his hand, her thoughts swirling with the clash from the day before. She had stood her ground, demanding that Angela's voice be heard, but doubt gnawed at her. What if she was wrong? What if trusting Angela over the physicians was nothing more than desperation? Angela entered quietly, carrying a small tray of food she had insisted on bringing from the mansion. She set it on the side table, her calm presence cutting through the tension. Rachel glanced at her, weary but curious. "What's that?" she asked, her voice flat. "Simple broth," Angela replied softly. Something easy, something warm, not what they'd prescribed, but something his body might recognize. Rachel frowned. They said he's too weak for anything solid. Angela nodded. I'm not ignoring them, but sometimes healing starts with familiarity. He hasn't had a proper meal in days. If his body remembers comfort, even in small ways, it might help him fight. Rachel studied her for a long moment, torn between caution and trust. Finally, she exhaled. Try. Angela dipped a spoon into the broth, lifting it carefully to Michael's lips. At first there was nothing. His mouth remained still, his eyes closed, but as the warmth touched his tongue, a faint movement followed. His lips parted slightly and he swallowed. Rachel gasped softly. He took it. Angela's eyes glistened, though her voice remained steady. Sometimes the body responds when the spirit finds something familiar. Over the next hour they continued slowly, cautiously. Michael's breathing steadied, his color faintly improved. It was no miracle, but it was change. Change neither the doctors nor their machines had managed to spark. When a nurse entered to check the monitors, she paused, surprised at the subtle improvements. His vitals look stronger, she murmured. Rachel caught the flicker of surprise in her eyes and turned to Angela with something like gratitude. For the first time in days, hope pressed through the fog of despair. Later, as night crept over Atlanta, Rachel sat beside Angela in the quiet corner of the room. The city lights outside shimmered faintly through the blinds. You were right, Rachel admitted, her voice low. I didn't want to believe it, but you were right. Angela folded her hands in her lap. I wasn't certain. I only trusted what I knew of him. Sometimes that's enough. Rachel's voice broke. I don't understand how you stayed by his side all these years, invisible, while he barely noticed you. Angela looked at her, her expression thoughtful. Because care doesn't always wait for recognition. Sometimes you serve because you know someone needs it, even if they never see it. Rachel's throat tightened. You've done more for him than I ever did, more than I thought I could. Angela shook her head. You're his daughter. Nothing replaces that. But he needed both of us, someone to love him as family, and someone to see what he couldn't see in himself. Their conversation ended as Michael stirred again. His eyelids fluttered open, and though his voice was faint, there was more strength in it than before. Rachel. Angela. His lips trembled into a fragile smile. Thank you. Rachel leaned forward, tears streaking her cheeks. Don't thank us yet. Just keep fighting. Angela touched the bed frame lightly, her quiet strength unshaken. For the first time, she felt that her choice to step forward had shifted the tide. The sterile world of medicine had not found the turning point. But in the warmth of human connection, in the small act of offering care beyond science, a fragile path toward healing had begun to emerge. Morning light spilled across the hospital room, soft and hesitant, as though it too was unsure how long this fragile calm would last. Michael Turner stirred against his pillows, his breathing less strained than before. Rachel had not left his side all night, her head resting against the mattress, her hand wrapped firmly around his. Angela sat quietly in the corner, watchful, her presence steady as always. When Michael's eyes opened fully, they lingered on his daughter. His voice was rough, but clear enough to reach her. Rachel. She lifted her head instantly, relief and disbelief colliding in her expression. You're awake, you're really awake. He gave a faint nod, his lips trembling as though unused to the shape of honesty. I thought I wouldn't see you again. Rachel's throat tightened. The words she had rehearsed in her mind for years, accusations, resentments, unspoken pain, pressed at her lips. Yet in this moment they tangled with the sight of his frailty. I was angry with you, she admitted softly, for so long, for missing everything that mattered. For always choosing the company over us. Michael's eyes closed briefly, shame darkening his expression. I know. I built walls, and I let them stand even when they hurt you. I thought providing was enough. I see now it wasn't. Tears welled in Rachel's eyes. It wasn't just about money. I needed a father. I needed you. Silence stretched between them, Heavy with years of wounds that had never been tended, Michael reached weakly for her hand, his grip frail but intent. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but if I get another chance, I want to try." Rachel squeezed his hand, her voice trembling. "Then don't waste it." In the corner, Angela watched the exchange with quiet reverence. She had seen families drift apart, had witnessed pride destroy bonds, but now she saw the fragile possibility of healing. For years, she had been the unseen witness to Michael's decline, but today she saw something rise in him that she had never seen before: humility. Michael turned his head toward Angela, his gaze lingering on her with rare clarity. "And you, I never said it, but you carried more than I knew. Caroline trusted you. Now I understand why." Angela felt her chest tighten. "I only did what needed to be done." "No," Michael said, his voice firmer than before. "You did more. You noticed what I ignored. You gave care where I gave nothing. That saved me." Rachel glanced at Angela, her eyes filled with gratitude. "He's right. You've been the bridge we didn't even realize we had." Angela lowered her gaze, humility woven into every line of her face. "I'm honored you feel that way, but I only stepped forward because silence would have cost too much." Rachel reached across the space between them, touching Angela's hand. "Then thank you for refusing to stay silent." The bond between the three of them, fragile yet undeniable, began to form in that moment. It was not a sudden absolution, nor a sweeping reconciliation, but the careful stitching of torn fabric. Words that had been buried for years now found air, and the silence that once separated them began to dissolve. As the morning deepened, Michael drifted into rest again, his hand still entwined with Rachel's. Angela remained close, her watch unbroken. The hospital room, once sterile and cold, now carried something new, something that could not be prescribed or charted. The old wounds had not vanished, but they were no longer festering in silence. And in their place, tentative bonds began to form, bonds that promised the possibility of rebuilding what had long seemed lost. The days that followed carried a fragile rhythm. Michael Turner remained in his hospital bed, his body slowly regaining strength, though every movement revealed how much had been taken from him. Machines still traced the lines of his survival, but the urgency had shifted. What once was a battle against collapse now became a struggle to rebuild. He spoke little, conserving his strength, but silence no longer felt like a wall. Instead, it became space where listening could grow. Rachel stayed close, reading aloud from old books she had once loved as a child, her voice filling the room with something warmer than clinical orders. Michael listened without interruption, his eyes soft, as though rediscovering the daughter he had too long overlooked. Angela remained ever steady, watching over him with quiet vigilance. She adjusted blankets, encouraged him to sip broth, and noticed small details, the subtle improvement in his skin tone, the steadier rhythm of his breaths. She spoke sparingly, yet when she did, her words carried weight. One afternoon, as Rachel read, Michael reached weakly for her hand. "Your voice," he murmured, his tone hoarse but sincere. "I should have listened years ago." Rachel's throat tightened. She paused, closing the book. "It's not too late to start," she said, though her voice trembled with the ache of lost time. Angela, standing nearby, saw the exchange and felt a deep current of quiet pride. She had long believed redemption required more than apologies. It required humility, and for the first time, she saw that humility in him. Later that evening, when Rachel stepped out to call family, Angela remained by Michael's side. The room was dim, the monitors casting faint glows across his tired face. He turned his head slightly toward her, his eyes carrying a depth she had never seen. "You were right," he whispered. Angela leaned closer. "About what?" "About me. I thought I could live without stopping. That control was strength, but it broke me." His voice cracked, but he pressed on. "You saw it long before I did, and I ignored it." Angela's chest tightened with emotion. "I only did what anyone would do." Michael shook his head faintly. "No, you did more. You cared when I didn't deserve it. You stayed, even when I treated you like air. That's not nothing, Angela. That's grace." For a moment, Angela had no words. She looked at him not as employer or patient, but as a man stripped of pride. "Then don't waste it," she said quietly. "If you've been given another chance, live differently this time. Listen more, carry less." His eyes glistened with unspoken emotion. He gave a faint nod, as if sealing a vow he had never imagined making. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of understanding, of unspoken forgiveness, of the fragile beginnings of redemption. When Rachel returned, she found her father more peaceful than she had seen him in years. He was not healed, not yet, but something deeper had shifted. The man who once filled every space with his authority now filled it with listening. In the quiet, he had discovered what his wealth had never given him: the courage to admit weakness, the humility to accept care, and the chance to mend what pride had broken. Angela sat in the corner again, her presence steady, her spirit calm. For years, her silence had been survival. Now it was strength, a silence that carried dignity, wisdom, and the power to help a man find redemption without needing to speak every word aloud. The sterile room, once suffocating, now held something almost sacred. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, one truth was clear: Michael Turner's redemption had begun not in his power, but in his surrender. The weeks that followed were marked by slow but undeniable progress. Michael Turner's strength returned in increments: a steadier pulse, longer moments of wakefulness, the faint return of color to his cheeks. For a man accustomed to commanding entire rooms, the act of lifting a spoon to his lips now felt like a victory. Yet with each small step forward, humility grew deeper within him. Rachel remained by his side, balancing phone calls with the company against hours spent in the hospital. She no longer carried the same edge in her voice when she spoke about Turner Capital. Instead, there was a new firmness, a quiet determination. For years, she had doubted her place in her father's empire. Now she began to see herself not as a shadow of him, but as someone capable of leading differently. One afternoon, she leaned over his bed, her tone direct. "Dad, the partners are restless. They're circling like vultures, waiting for a chance to take control. But I've stepped in. I've been working with the board, stabilizing things." Michael's brows furrowed, a flash of old instinct crossing his face. You shouldn't have to carry that." Rachel straightened, her voice steady. "I can carry it. I want to. But not the way you did. Not by killing myself for it. I'll run the company, but it won't run me." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Michael's lips curved into a weak but genuine smile. "You're stronger than I ever was. Stronger because you know when to stop." Angela, who had entered quietly with fresh linens, overheard the exchange. She glanced at Rachel with quiet pride, before focusing back on her task. Yet even she felt the weight of change in the room, father and daughter finding their footing in a balance they had never known. Later that evening, as dusk settled outside, Michael gestured weakly toward Angela. "Please, sit with us." Angela hesitated. "Mr. Turner, I should—" He interrupted gently. "No, please. Not as staff. As someone who saved me." She sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. For years she had avoided such positions, always careful not to blur the lines between employer and servant. But now, Michael's eyes carried no superiority, only gratitude. "I never saw you," he admitted, his voice gravelly. "Not truly. And yet, you were the one who kept me standing when I didn't even know I was falling." Angela's expression softened. "Sometimes people only see what they want." "But that doesn't mean the care wasn't real." Rachel leaned forward, her eyes shining with unspoken emotion. "Angela, you've been more than staff to this family. To me, you've been an anchor. I don't think I could have faced these weeks without you." Angela shook her head slightly. "I only did what needed to be done." Michael's gaze fixed on her, unwavering. "No. You did what none of us had the courage to do. You saw the truth and you acted when everyone else stood back. I'll never forget that." The air in the room shifted, heavy with sincerity. Angela felt warmth spread through her chest, not from pride, but from the quiet dignity of being seen at last. In the days that followed, Michael's recovery continued. Rachel found her footing as a leader, proving to the board that she was capable not because she mirrored her father, but because she led differently. Angela remained close, supporting them both, her role no longer confined to the shadows. The house in Buckhead awaited Michael's return, but it would not be the same. The silence that once haunted its halls had begun to give way to something new, an understanding built not on wealth or power, but on reconciliation and care. For the first time in years, the Turner family, fractured and fragile, had begun to feel whole again. The day Michael Turner returned home was clear and bright, sunlight spilling across the polished driveway of the Buckhead mansion. Yet, as he stepped through the familiar doors with Rachel at his side and Angela close behind, the house no longer carried the same hollow chill it once had. Something within its walls had shifted, as though the silence that once reigned had given way to a softer, warmer presence. He paused in the grand foyer, leaning slightly on the cane the doctors had recommended, his body still fragile but his spirit steadier than ever. The marble floor gleamed as always, the chandeliers sparkled, but for the first time he did not look at the luxury around him with pride. He looked at it with humility. Rachel guided him toward the study, helping him settle into the leather chair that once symbolized control and dominance. Now it felt less like a throne and more like a seat where new choices could be made. Angela lingered near the doorway, uncertain. She had accompanied them back out of duty, but part of her wondered if this was where her path ended. After all, she had been the maid, and Michael was no longer helpless. But before she could step back, Michael raised his voice, soft but firm. "Angela, don't stand at the door. Sit with us." Her eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Turner, I shouldn't—" "Please," he interrupted, a faint smile forming. "Not as staff, as family." Rachel nodded, her expression warm. "He's right. You've earned that place 1,000 times over." Slowly, Angela sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her heart raced with the weight of belonging. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then Michael spoke, his words deliberate. "I spent my life believing power meant standing above others, but I see now it's the opposite. Real strength is letting others hold you when you can't stand alone, and both of you." His gaze moved between Rachel and Angela. "You held me when I had nothing left." Rachel blinked back tears, her voice steady but thick. "Then don't waste this second chance, Dad. Don't go back to who you were." Michael nodded. "I won't, I can't. I'm not the same man anymore." He turned toward Angela, his eyes filled with gratitude. "And I'll never forget that when surgeons failed, when pride failed, it was you who stepped forward. You saved me, Angela, not just my body, but the part of me I thought was gone." Angela's chest tightened, emotion rising despite her composed exterior. "I only did what I knew was right." "Anyone could have." Michael shook his head faintly. "Not anyone. Many stood back. You didn't. That's what made the difference." Rachel reached for Angela's hand, squeezing it gently. "She's right, Angela. You didn't just save him. You gave me back my father." Angela lowered her gaze, humbled beyond words. For years she had worked in silence, invisible. Now she was seen not as a maid, but as the person who had carried them through their darkest hour. Outside, the Atlanta sky stretched wide and endless, the world continuing as always. But within the Turner household, something new had begun. Old wounds were not erased, but they were mending. Power no longer sat in marble and glass, but in humility, gratitude, and bonds restored. Michael leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at him, but peace settling in. "From now on, we move forward differently. No more standing alone. No more silence." Rachel smiled faintly, wiping her eyes. "Together, then." Angela, for the first time in years, allowed herself a small smile as well. Together. And so, what had begun as collapse ended as renewal. A man who once believed control defined him now found freedom in surrender. A daughter who once carried anger found space for forgiveness, and a woman who had lived in the shadows stepped into the light, her strength undeniable. Before you go, remember to subscribe to this channel for more stories of resilience and transformation. And don't forget to click the suggested video on your screen now. You won't want to miss where the next story leads.